Quick disclaimer, there's some stronger than usual violence at the end of the episode today. Please check out the post on mythpodcast.com for more info. This week, on Myths and Legends, it's stories of goblins from Korean folklore. We'll see how to get out of a dinner where you're the main course and why you should skip lunch. It might be your ticket to all-you-can-eat floor beef. The creature this time is the squirrel from Norse myth, and he hates his job. This is Myths and Legends, episode 365, Goblin. This is a podcast where we tell stories from mythology and folklore. Some are incredibly popular stories you might think you know, but with surprising origins, and others are tales that might be new to you, but are definitely worth a listen. Today, there are two stories of goblins, dokebi, from Korean folklore. Instead of a lengthy intro, we'll jump right into the story and just talk about them as we go. In the story, a dokebi is going out to dinner at a human's house, to eat that human for dinner. The dokebi took form outside the shack. His hanbok fluttered to the grass as the forest grew silent all around. The sounds died every time his feet touched the dirt. The animals could feel him. People weren't so lucky. Some of his kind played their games. His way was longer, but easier. Find a hermit, maybe a couple living on their own, far from the villages. When they answered the door and saw his face, his true face, there would be no question. He liked the screams the most. Well, that was a lie. He loved all of it. The terror, the fight, the slow resignation when they saw that no help was coming, that no hope would be theirs. The despair as they felt the darkness closing in on them. He loved his job. The shack, when the dokebi drew close, was a house, a tidy, sturdy thing. The walk was swept, the wood piled. A small garden bloomed with life. He would enjoy some cabbage with his hermit. Now was the moment. Fingers became claws and rapped on the wood of the door that muffled a quizzical, Moments later, feet shuffled, wood creaked. The door opened and the hermit's eyes found the dokebis, the goblins, the demons. This was the moment. This was the... Wait, where was the scaredness part? The dokebi lied earlier. The first glance was his favorite bit. Now, do you know what I am? The monster growled. Yes, you do. Yes. Then what am I? I want to hear you say it. You're a dokebi. You don't need to do that voice. Unless that's your actual voice, then you do you. You're scary enough without it. It's almost cartoonish. The man shuffled back to the center of the room. A table dragged on the wood, and the man brought out two seats. There's nothing cartoonish about what's going to happen to you, except maybe something from an itchy and scratchy cartoon. But this isn't simply a pastiche lampooning cartoon violence, but a serious situation involved. I'm sorry. What is happening right now? Okay, most people, by this point, they're pleading or running or throwing up a futile defense. What are you, is that soju? A grin broke to a smile. The man gestured for the dokebi to sit. The dokebi hesitated. So the goblin did not want to drink? The dokebi said, well, he did like a drink. He usually partook after his victims were thoroughly victimized, but he didn't like to drink alone. I love to drink alone, the hermit laughed. He wanted to drink with the one person he actually liked. He'd make an exception now, too, since his visitor wasn't a person, and he was going to be murdered today. We don't really consider it to be murder. The dokebi did take that seat. It's like, do you consider killing a cow to be murder? This is just like really free-range farming for us. I'd call it hunting, but it's really not. None of you put up enough of a fight. That's fair. I'm a vegetarian, but your logic tracks. He poured the soju into the clay cups before looking off into the forest, resuming its song. He took a drink. So do you always eat people? The hermit asked. The dokebi shrugged, like, mostly. Not always, though. Sometimes the dokebi just beat them up, changed their bodies to hilarious proportions, tickled them. The hermit set down his cup. Tickled them? Really? The dokebi said, yeah, tickled. Did the hermit have a problem with that? The hermit just said, it doesn't really seem that bad. Being tickled? Oh, so you liked being tickled relentlessly by strangers? The dokebi asked. No? Well, there you go. The dokebi shrugged. That reminded him of a time when he was out with his buds. The dokebi chuckled to himself. The hermit asked if he was about to be eaten anyway. He would like to hear about a time when all the dokebi were hanging out. Maybe it was the soju. Maybe it was the unassuming hermit, but the dokebi was feeling good. Sure. Yeah. He would tell the hermit the tale. Quick note, though. There will be a shift in perspectives that the hermit might find jarring. The hermit took a drink and said he thought that he could keep up. The young man arrived at his parents' house to see them struggling. I'm sorry, are these your parents? Are you the boy? Is this your origin story? The hermit asked. A sharp inhale and a look from the dokebi reminded the hermit. Perspective shift. Right. That wasn't him. Okay, sorry. Go on, please. The dokebi cleared his throat and did continue on. The young man found his parents hungry, dirty. Their ability to care for themselves had long since deteriorated, but he thought that his older brother had been coming by to help them. It's not that the younger one was lazy. It was just that to intrude on his older brother's duty was to imply that his older brother was lacking or in need of his help. And he wasn't, the younger brother learned when he asked the older brother about it later on that day, after he managed to scrounge up some food for his parents. The older brother was in perfect health and had plenty of time and money. He just didn't care. He said he had tried to go every other day to bring them food and tidy up, but sometimes a day here or there turned into a week. Not his fault for having a life. The younger brother said if the older permitted him, he would like to help. Permit? Please, yes, do it, the older brother said. This wasn't so much him failing in his filial duties, but delegating. He would be by to check up on his brother's work. Thanks. It was pointless to argue, and the younger brother knew it. He accepted this new duty and got to work the following day. Work was, well, it was more work than he thought. Supporting both of them and himself meant that he was out in the forest far longer, far later than usual. Today had been a good day, though. He didn't even need his axe. There was a storm the previous night, so the forest floor was covered in branches. The morning was spent picking the good from the bad, the hard from the rotten. The afternoon was putting them into piles and binding them. He couldn't take all of them today, but he would stash them and come out over the next week. Around evening, he plopped down by a tree, and something else plopped down on his head. A hazelnut sat in the dirt. He picked it up and inspected it. His father would love this. Another hit the ground, one for his mother. Two more, one for his brother and his sister-in-law. A final one, a hazelnut for him. He looked up with a smile, but the smile evaporated when he saw the clouds darkening the sky. The young man scrambled to his feet, tossed the bundles in the hollow of a giant tree, and loaded one on his back. He didn't make it 100 meters before giant raindrops were slapping his face. When his foot slipped and he almost tumbled down the mountain, the young man knew he had to find someplace to wait out the storm. It wasn't too much longer when he spotted it. A house, well, what was left of a house. Rain dripped through the roof in the corner, and the windows didn't close. But it was better than he could have hoped for. He propped his wood up under the eaves and went inside. Around sunset, the tap of the rain in the corner became less and less frequent, and he thought he might be able to get home now. He rose and froze. Voices, a half dozen off in the forest, and they were getting closer. He paced the room. He didn't dare run off into the forest at night. He might plow straight into one of them, and he knew who they were. Well, not definitively, but a group of people out here in the forest at night, they were thieves, and this was their hideout. There was nowhere to run, Then he glanced up. Minutes later, laying on the rafter, the young man heard the brigands stomp into the room. He allowed himself a glance, and it was so much worse than he feared. Dokebi, goblins, the monsters of the forest. Their humbocks fluttered as they filled the small house and propped their clubs up against the wall. They laughed as they told stories in the night and what they had been up to. Beating people, robbing people, eating people, all in all, great night. Now, though, it was wine time. One Dokebi grabbed his club and, hitting the floor and walls, said some variation of thump thump or dokebi, dokebi, doke doke dokebi, and come out wine. With the final hit, a jug of wine appeared. The others grabbed their clubs and did the same. Steaming beef, pork, and rice appeared when they were summoned, and one guy was just low-key tapping the whole time, causing gold coins to trickle out of his club onto the ground while they all talked and ate. Up in the rafters, the young man was struggling. He realized that he never had the rice he packed for lunch. He would be fine normally, but his stomach howled and groaned. Did anyone else hear that? One of the Dokebi asked the others. The goblins looked to each other. Hear what? The Dokebi shook his head. Must just be thunder off in the distance. Oh well. Pass the wine. The young man exhaled, but knew that he wouldn't be so lucky a second time. He had to do something. His bag was propped up by the wood outside. Then he remembered the hazelnuts. Lightly pinching a hazelnut from his pocket, the young man brought it up to his mouth and bit down as quietly as he could. The bite was quiet. The subsequent crack was not. The Dokebi below froze, and they all looked up. Go, 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 they said, rising and running to the door as fast as they could. Why can't we ever stay in nice houses? One cried. Ones that won't fall down if we hit them hundreds of times with clubs. Laying on the rafters, the young man chewed, and the cracking sound ricocheted through the cabin and, from the Dokebi's remarks, out of it as well. Still, if they stuck around for more than a few minutes, they would see that the cabin was fine. He needed another solution. The young man breathed. He thought of one, and hoped that everything he heard about the Dokebi was true, or else this would be the last thing he ever did. Cock-a-doodle-doo! The young man cried out in his, and yes, my best impression of a rooster. He froze, I winced, and you probably cringed a little. The Dokebi, though, they bought it. One cried out that there was no way, it was too early. Another said that they had been drinking for hours. Who knew how late it was? The house wasn't safe, and the forest wouldn't block enough light. They had to go before the sun rose, and they were trapped. The young man exhaled when he heard the sound of their clawed feet crunching leaves and cracking sticks get farther and farther away. He stayed in the rafters until the sun poured through the holes in the roof. As he lowered himself, eager to get to yesterday's lunch in the pack outside, he noticed something. A club propped up against the wall. One Dokebi, in its panic, had left its magic club. The young man walked over, gripped the handle, and, tapping on the floor, cried out either thump thump or doke doke dokebi, and, yeah, summoned hot beef and rice there on the floor. Nice bowl, too. He devoured the magical dinner. We'll see what the young man does with his new magical club and catch up with the hermit, but that will be right after this. The parents laughed at the story. That was nice. I mean, completely fake, like 100% a hallucination, but nice. They were glad he was safe. Their smiles dropped almost as fast as the gold on the floor, then the food with all the bonchon, then the wine. What? The young man provided for his parents, bought them all a big new house, but more than that, he provided for his village. And so it wasn't long until the older brother found out that his parents, the people he saw as little more than a stone around his neck as he was trying to swim, were not only fine without him, but flourishing, thriving. They had more money than he did somehow, so he reconciled with his younger brother. It had been easy because his younger brother was very kind and forgiving and the dummy. The lunches and the walks and the taking an interest in his life were for one reason and one reason only: to find out how his brother got so rich. He heard the story many times, but he didn't believe it until he saw the beef and the wine drop from the club. And then he needed to hear every detail again. Now, lying in the rafters, the older brother heard the dokebi as they clambered into the abandoned house and started their partying. Sometime around midnight, the older brother pulled a hazelnut from his pocket, put it in his mouth, and bit down. A crack echoed through the house. The dokebi froze, and then a claw found the older brother's cloak, yanking him from the ceiling and pulling him down hard to the floor. This was him. This was the guy who faked the crack in the roof and did that terrible, cringy rooster impression and stole the club. The brother held up his hands. No, that wasn't him. It didn't matter, the dokebi said to the hermit. Back in our main story, we beat him up in a hilarious fashion. Not only did we treat ourselves to some blunt force trauma, but where we hit him, the big parts became small, small became big, medium parts but stayed medium. That part was a boring discovery. We knocked him around a bit, did some tickling, and then left him there. Never did get my club back, though. What happened to the brother? The hermit asked. The dokebi took another sip of his soju and shrugged while the hermit poured him more. He said he didn't know. He heard things, like the older brother went back to the younger, hilariously misshapen, and the younger brother bopped him back to his previous proportions. The older brother apologized and changed, and they all lived happily ever after. The dokebi tied a bib around his neck. All right, where did they... He looked over at the hermit, arms crossed and shaking his head. Nope, I don't buy that story, the hermit said. The dokebi said, well, the dokebi did have magical clubs that could make anything, change people, all sorts of stuff. He just didn't have his because it was taken by some nice human. The hermit said, yeah, he knew that. He was literally talking to a goblin. He didn't take issue with that part. No, his beef was with the ending. The older brother, changing? People don't change. The dokebi said that, well, that seemed like kind of a weird sticking point, but he'll bite. Not literally, though definitely literally soon. People usually found that sort of ending heartwarming. Yeah, and fake, the hermit fumed. And also, popularity wasn't the best metric for a good ending. Sure, the older brother was penitent after just being punished, and that might stick around for a bit, but people don't change. That brother was still the man who abandoned his duties. He was greedy and shameless, and the younger brother should have left him. But the younger brother was a doormat, and, well, he would get what he deserved, too. Wow, have you always been like this? The dokebi laughed. The hermit said since he opened his eyes to see people as they really were, yes. Why did the dokebi think that the hermit was, a hermit? He wouldn't inflict his misanthropy on people if they would just leave him alone, but it never seemed to work out that way, so here he was. The dokebi paused and then laughed. He untied the bib. The hermit and him, they had something in common. He, too, hated most people. The dokebi said, okay, he actually had a pleasant evening tonight. Even if the hermit disliked his fellow human, he had to get lonely up here in the mountains by himself. The hermit worked his way up to a nod. Yeah. The dokebi clapped. Well, why didn't they make this into a normal thing? In recompense for the dokebi not eating him, the hermit would supply food and drink, and they would have dinner together, like once a week. Maybe because the hermit really did want a friend. Maybe because the alternative was being immediately murdered and consumed by a monster, the hermit said that sounded like a fantastic idea. He saw the dokebi out and did something that, for the last few hours, had been against all odds. He went to bed that night. And even though it was under no small degree of duress, the dinners were actually really nice. The hermit had stories of his own, and the dokebis were wild. Most of them didn't eat humans at all. In fact, they could be quite different from one another. There is a tidy list floating around the internet of the different types of dokebi that I can't seem to source. I posted it in the show notes to be part of the problem, I guess. But according to this list, one that could just be from some K-drama being passed around as folklore, there are at least 8 common types of dokebi. There's the mischievous one, the peasant one, the sweet one, the bachelor one, the bad boy, and as I'm writing this, I'm even more suspicious because this really does sound like a boy band. There's also the one-legged one and one-eyed dokebis, rounding out the group, which are not part of your standard boy band tropey types, but maybe they should be. Anyway, both the hermit and the gay dokebi, I guess is the category for this one since he's the bad boy and consumes humans, well, they became friends. Sure, their time together was generally spent with the hermit talking about how much he hated people, and the dokebi talking about how much he liked eating people, and both of them telling stories to that effect. He realized it was better than being alone. And he might have kept thinking that, well, forever, had he not taken a bath. Now, bathing is good, and I am by no means anti-bathing. I am, however, anti-introspection. You push that self-knowledge down far enough, you keep yourself ignorant of who you are and what you've become, you never have to deal with it. That's a Myths and Legends life lesson for you kids. When the hermit saw his own face in the river, though, he almost didn't realize he was looking into a mirror. The face he was looking at was a familiar one, but it wasn't his own. It was the face of the dokebi. Well, not completely. He still saw the face he remembered from his youth, and an odd glance in a pool of water or shiny surface, but that face was buried underneath the grim, craggy face of the goblin were eyes that he still recognized, but they were fading. In his time with the dokebi and sharing stories and drinks, the hermit was turning into a dokebi himself. He scrambled from the riverside and, panting, sat on the shore staring up at the sky. He stayed there for a long time, thinking. The hermit had heard stories about the goblin's heartlessness. Well, the K-dokebi, not the sweet one, the bachelor, or any of the others. This one, the evil type, took joy in killing, and the hermit knew that he would be next if he just told the dokebi to stop coming around, that he was scared of what the time with the dokebi was turning him into. So he came up with another plan. At the outset, the other plan looked a lot like the first. Stay the course. The next few times the dokebi came over, the hermit poured him drinks and they got to talking. Each time after the dokebi left, the hermit could feel his skin and teeth and hair change just a little bit more. Then, one time, he set the drink down and asked a question. What was the dokebi afraid of? The goblin's red eyes looked him up and down, cocking an eyebrow. Okay, he will be honest here. He was afraid of, well, blood. The hermit put his hands on the table, hunching over. He was planning to act surprised, but to his surprise, he didn't need to act at all. Blood. But the dokebi was stone cold killer, I know. I have my ways of limiting blood, the dokebi laughed. He had never told anyone that. Felt good. All right. Now it was the hermit's turn. What was he afraid of? The hermit told him, and the dokebi was just as surprised as the hermit had been. Really? But humans love that stuff. The hermit shrugged. The dokebi looked around. It did help him to understand the hermit's living situation a little bit better, though. We'll see what the hermit's fear is, but that will, once again, be right after this. The hermit stroked the cow's head. She wasn't afraid. She should be, but she wasn't. The dokebi was set to arrive just a few minutes after dusk, as he usually did. The cow tried to move, but the hermit held her by the rope around her neck. She had been a good cow. but she hadn't had milk in years. He had been taking care of her because, as he now saw, he had been so desperately lonely that it was nice to have anything around, even if it was a cow who barely seemed to know where she was half the time. There was a knock at the door. "Come in," the hermit yelled, and the door slid open. The dokebi was a shadow, even in darkness, as he looked inside with a smile. What was this, another thing to join them? He only brought one bottle, and she looked like she could handle a little bit more. "She won't be sticking around," the hermit said. And, as he drew his kitchen knife, whispered an "I'm sorry" to the bovine. He drew the knife across the cow's neck. The creature bellowed, and the blood sprayed. It pelted the walls, the hermit, and the dokebi in the doorway, before slowing to a pour. A torrent washed over the floor, and the dokebi staggered back. "Is this a joke to you? I told you that in confidence," the dokebi screeched. "Come on," the hermit called out to the goblin, backing up into the night. Couldn't the dokebi see how funny this was? The dokebi recoiled as it wiped blood from its face. No, this wasn't a joke. This wasn't okay. He would have his revenge. He would come back with what the hermit feared most. "No!" the hermit screamed as the cow's legs gave out, and she tumbled onto the floor. Please, anything but that." But all the hermit could see was the dokebi's rage-soaked red eyes, fading into the forest at night. It was 3 days before the dokebi came to take his revenge. The hermit really hoped it would be instantaneous because he did not want to deal with that cow, but by the next morning she was already smelling. The hermit didn't fear blood, but he didn't enjoy it, and there was a lot of cow to move. By the time he managed to get all of it into the pit to decompose, all he could think about was sleep, even with the dokebi's threat hanging over his head. He laid down and closed his eyes. He must have slept for almost 24 hours because, when he awoke, the goblin was standing over him. He didn't have knives or even his claws out. He had bags. "You are my friend, but I shall do to you what you did to me. You shall be covered in your greatest fear and left to writhe in it," the dokebi said, and opened the bag. Gold pieces, the hermit's greatest fear, at least his self-reported greatest fear to the dokebi, pelted the man in the face. "Oh no, not gold and riches, his worst fear. It burns, but on like a psychological and emotional level, which is actually way worse than physical pain." The hermit scrambled to stop the rain of gold, but the dokebi swatted his hands away. As the hermit's face disappeared beneath the gold, he thought of something really sad, namely having to kill his favorite cow, and the gold finally covered the tears as the hermit begged the dokebi to please kill him. With a word, the dokebi gave his answer. No. The hermit deserved to not only exist in the thing he feared most, but to keep this memory forever. The hermit did his best Darth Vader no, as the dokebi left laughing. And for the remainder of the night, the hermit did his best to sell his anguish. When the sun finally arose, the hermit knew he was safe. He sat up, exhausted, and marveled at the pile of gold that surrounded him. Then he sighed. Three months later, the hermit paused by the riverside. He unwound his scarf, but quickly wrapped himself back up when a person passed. A friend. They stopped and talked for a good bit, and the hermit said he would be by later on that week. He had moved out of his house in the mountains, not only because it was now known by a vicious dokebi, but because, well, he saw where that path ended. Not solitude. Solitude is not bad. I'm an introvert, and I'm in no way bashing alone time. No, there was the bitterness, the anger, the misanthropy. In his dealings with other people, he could see that he was part of those dealings. A conversation was just that, a conversation. He was half of it. You go in expecting the worst out of people, then you're probably going to find it. At the very least, those people will be less than hospitable, and you'll see what you wanted to see the whole time. So he gave people another chance. Tried to approach them with an open mind and accepting attitude, and found the world that he left utterly changed. It also probably helped out that he was extremely generous with his money, and everyone wanted to be his friend. But whether he realized this consciously or not is unclear. The former hermit, alone again, dared to take the scarf from his face. Looking at his reflection in the river, he smiled. The reflection was once again his. He stuffed the scarf into his pack. He no longer had any need for it. He went back home, to the village. The original definitely does not include the story from the middle. That's a second story from folklore that I wanted to include in a thematic way. The original does include the hermit and the dokebi bonding to the point where the hermit emerged unharmed, and the two struck up a friendship, which pushed the hermit to realize that he needed to have more kindness and understanding with his fellow humans, lest he turn into a monster too. Next week, we're back in the journey to the west, and we'll see that, well, gardening's fun. It can get a little weird, though, when you actually fall in love with your plants. The creature this time is Ratatoskr, from Norse mythology. Ratatoskr is, as the Washington Post describes, the most celebrated squirrel in Norse mythology, which, I mean, that's an honor. Sure, it's like calling me the most celebrated folklore podcaster in Ohio. It's nice. It's maybe accurate unless Aaron Mahnke moves to the Midwest. Ratatoskr, the squirrel that runs up and down the world tree in Norse myth, is the only squirrel in Norse myth, so yeah, he's the most celebrated. He's also a one-squirrel game of telephone. You see, at the top of the world tree, Yggdrasil, the central sacred tree that exists at the center of all the worlds in Norse myth, there's an eagle, and, inexplicably, a hawk that sits between the eyes of the eagle. They absolutely need to talk to Nidhogg, the dragon or snake that rests coiled around the bottom of the world tree, gnawing at, well, a lot of things. Some sources say that Nidhogg gnaws on the roots of the world tree, but it actually has a far more gruesome chewing gum: corpses. In Hel, hell in Norse mythology, the place of the dishonored dead, there's a section for murderers and severe oath breakers. This region is probably not as full as we'd all like to think it is, since in some Scandinavian societies, you could legally murder someone if you challenged them, or if you paid money to their family afterwards. Still, Nidhogg has plenty of murderers to chew on and, thus, no time to travel. Needing to communicate with the birds at the top of the tree for reasons that are never really explained, and said birds not really wanting to rebalance at the corpse buffet, they all enlisted the help of Ratatoskr, the squirrel with, inexplicably, a unicorn horn. Now, Ratatoskr has one job: to communicate messages up and down the tree. It does not want to do that job, though, so it just yells insults at both the birds and the serpent. Interpretations of this seem to have Ratatoskr as an agent of chaos, a symbol of the, quote, tumultuous and unpredictable nature of existence, the constant flux that characterizes the natural and the cosmic order. Which, maybe, I don't know. I kind of think that the squirrel just likes messing with animals who not only can't be bothered to talk to each other, but also stop the squirrel from insulting them. I've never read the book Squirrels, an Animal Answer Guide, but it's apparently a squirrel book for adults. The author of that book is quoted for Ratatoskr as saying, quote, "It takes little imagination for you to think that a squirrel is saying nasty things about you." Which, I actually think it takes a lot of imagination to think a squirrel is saying nasty things about me. Like, more than a reasonable amount of imagination. Unless you're an eagle with a hawk balanced on your head, or a serpent chewing on corpses. Then that squirrel is absolutely saying nasty things about you. That's it for this time. Myths and Legends is by Jason and Carissa Weiser. Our theme song is by Broke for Free, and the Creature of the Week music is by Steve Combs. There are links to even more of the music we used in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.